When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time: the expert witnesses.
An expert witness is critical because they're going to have that deep level knowledge to really determine if something stands out that doesn't look quite right.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
My brain just sort of exploded with different ideas. Even a single-celled organism can solve a crime.
They search harder and look deeper, using the very latest techniques.
They're constantly evolving, constantly improving. It's soon going to become impossible to get away with murder.
This is the inside story of how science helps solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
That was one of my eureka moments in all my 30 years of forensic examination.
The chances of finding something were really incredibly slim. That tiny possibility had to be explored.
I've seen people talk about justice being done, but no matter what kind of punishment he faced, it would never be enough.
This is the story of the expert witness. In this programme, an expert witness tries to find out what killed a healthy 38-year-old man in Yorkshire.
In this case, there was no grey area. It was black and white.
And we reveal how groundbreaking technology helped Scottish police solve a gruesome murder.
The fact that the depiction in this case was key to the murder conviction is obviously very satisfying for us.
Food's part of our everyday lives. My job is to take that food apart forensically. And in this case, the difference between what the food should have been and what the food was the difference between life and death, innocence and guilt.
January 2014, Easingwold in North Yorkshire, where 38-year-old father of one, Paul Wilson, was a manager in a local pub. One evening, on his day off, he ordered a curry from the local takeaway, the Indian Garden. As he sat down at home to eat, he phoned his parents, Keith and Margaret.
Said he got his curry, he was home, and his last words were, I love you both, and I've told tomorrow.
But Margaret never got to speak to her son again.
At 2:30, we were knocked up by the police to say that Paul had died.
This was an unusual case. Paul was found on the evening of the 30th of January 2014. The detective sergeant attended, and he made some key decisions around the preservation of evidence, specifically the meal that Paul had eaten, and also the packaging of the meal, where it was clearly written, no nuts. That was the fundamental point, the preservation of the meal. Without that meal, we would never have been able to prove where that had come from. There was some inquiries made on the night which established that Paul did have a peanut allergy.
It was Paul's mother who had confirmed to police that he had a peanut allergy, which was first diagnosed aged 7.
He was rushed to Sheffield Children's Hospital and diagnosed then that he had this nut allergy.
Now, more than 30 years later, detectives asked whether Paul's peanut allergy could explain his sudden death. They consulted expert witness and food analyst Dr. Duncan Campbell.
This peanut weighs about ½ a gram. There's enough peanut in here to kill 25 people with a peanut allergy. That's how dangerous a single peanut is to people who suffer from a peanut allergy.
Detectives now turn their attention to the takeaway dinner. It said it contained no nuts, But was that true? They sent the meal to Dr. Duncan Campbell for analysis, along with the contents of Paul's stomach. Paul had ordered a chicken tikka masala and 2 onion bhajis. One bhaji had a single bite taken from it, the other was untouched. The chicken and the masala sauce appeared not to have been eaten. Yet there were high levels of peanuts found in Paul's stomach.
The onion bhaji contained a certain amount of peanut. We had 2. One was untouched, one had had a bite removed. The amount missing was not enough to account for the peanut in his stomach.
Next, Dr. Campbell analysed the ingredients of the chicken tikka masala and made a shocking discovery.
We established that the food contained almost 20% of peanut by weight. The sauce had been thickened by powdered peanut. Mr. Wilson, I think, had expected it to be thickened by powdered almond, to which he was not allergic, whereas, of course, he was allergic to the peanut.
Paul had not eaten the chicken tikka masala, but Dr. Campbell had a theory to explain how its high peanut content nonetheless caused his death.
Perhaps he had licked the spoon, and the amount of peanut in the sauce was such that less than a teaspoon of it would account for the peanut in his stomach when you added in the amount of the onion bhaji. He hadn't eaten the meal, he had merely tasted it, and that was enough to kill him.
Detectives investigated the restaurant that had cooked Paul's meal, the Indian Garden, which is no longer trading from this building. It was one of a group of restaurants that included the Jaipur Spice, which is now under new management. Inquiries revealed just weeks earlier, despite being advised of her nut allergy, the Jaipur Spice has sold a meal containing nuts to Ruby Scott.
As soon as I tasted it, I could feel my lips swelling up and my throat started to constrict. My friend's dad rushed me to hospital and my mum didn't recognise me at first because I was all covered in hives and like purple by this point.
Ruby was lucky to survive. Now, Detective Andy Palmer began a search of the Indian Garden.
I was tasked initially with visiting the Indian Garden restaurant and facilitating a search and also speaking to the members of staff.
Police recovered CCTV footage that showed Paul collecting his meal. They recovered the order docket from the kitchen, which clearly said no nut. And they already had the packaging which said the same thing. Now, Andy's investigation hinted at what had gone wrong.
Of the 4 people working in the restaurant that night, the only person working there legally was the pot washer, and that the chef working that night had had no training whatsoever in food hygiene or food safety.
Detectives continued to dig. They found that the group of companies that included the Indian Garden and the Jaipur Spice was owned by Mohammed Zaman, and that he and his companies were nearly £300,000 in debt.
We felt that potentially there was a motivation to cut corners and save money by using a cheaper ingredient, even though there were risks in doing so. And when we spoke to Mr. Zaman's suppliers, they informed us that about a year previously he'd changed from almond to peanut, and that they had actually warned him that peanut was more likely to provoke an allergic reaction in someone with an allergy.
Ground almonds pose far less risk to nut allergy sufferers, but it costs £4 more per kilo than ground peanuts.
No one intended Paul to die, but what happened under Mr. Zaman's watch was so bad that it was a crime, and absolutely Paul should be still here today.
In the first case of its kind in the UK, Mohammed Zaman was charged with corporate manslaughter for the death of Paul Wilson.
Obviously, the key evidence was the analysis of the food that Paul had ordered that showed a massive amount of peanut. When you took that and had the packaging, which said no nut written on it, we had the chitty from the restaurant where the waiter had taken the order from Paul and actually written no nuts on that. Those, for me, were really fundamental to the case.
The prosecution also provided evidence from Trade and Standards regarding meals they'd analysed from Mr. Zaman's other restaurants.
The jury was told to cut costs, he stopped using almond powder in dishes, which is less likely to cause a reaction, and used cheaper ground nut powder containing peanuts instead.
One of the fundamental points to prove was that the meal that came from the restaurant caused Paul's death, and Duncan was able to do that.
In this case, there was no grey area. Given Mr. Wilson's allergy and the huge amount of peanut present, it was black and white. There was enough peanut in the tiny part of that meal to kill Mr. Wilson. In this case, the difference between a meal where the sauce contained almond and the meal with a sauce containing peanut was the difference between life or death.
On the 23rd of May at Teesside Crown Court, in the first case of its kind in the UK, Mohammed Zaman was convicted of corporate manslaughter and was sentenced to 6 years in prison for causing the death of Paul Wilson.
The restaurant owner responsible for his death repeatedly lied during his trial and was utterly indifferent to the health and lives of his customers.
It was the expert witness report by Dr. Duncan Campbell that provided the crucial evidence needed to convict Mohammed Zaman for the death of Paul Wilson.
I think clearly my evidence needed to be there. Without it, there is no proof that the meal, Mr. Wilson's last meal, contained peanut.
No one intended to cause Paul's death, but from my point of view, Paul should not have died. And Paul wasn't the only victim. His parents, Margaret and Keith, and his son Cameron, they're victims as well, and they've got to live through this for the rest of their life.
Restaurants, suppliers, people who make the food, so this doesn't happen, more awareness, so this doesn't happen to anybody else, you know, because I don't want anybody to go through what we've gone through.
The verdict of corporate manslaughter that was found on the restaurant owner was described as landmark, and I think it was. Ultimately, every single death which is avoidable due to allergens and food is tragic.
I was happy with the conviction for gross negligence manslaughter, which was actually the first conviction of its kind for any restaurant owner or any business where a person had died as a result of an allergic reaction.
Since Mohammed Zaman's conviction for corporate manslaughter in 2016, a number of similar cases have come to court in the UK. Thanks to the evidence provided by Dr. Duncan Campbell and other expert witnesses, several of these cases have also resulted in convictions.
We should all feel safe when we go and order food, that we take it for granted that the food we're getting, we're going to enjoy and we're going to be safe. And we don't think that we're going to die after we eat it.
When we produce facial depictions of people from human remains, our job is to adapt it so that we're making it look more like a living person and less like a dead face.
April 2008, Arbroath, Scotland. After a stormy night, a gruesome discovery is made on the beach. Retired BBC Scotland journalist Andrew Anderson reported on the case at the time.
Two young sisters are on the beach playing, and they come across a plastic supermarket carrier bag. And one can only imagine their horror when they discover a human head inside the carrier bag. There's a huge police operation then gets underway. The beach is cordoned off, and then sometime later, they find a pair of hands on the beach.
It was clear to Tayside police that the victim was a woman. But with no females recently reported missing, they had no way to identify her and no way to begin to track down whoever was responsible for this horrific crime.
Whoever's carried out this brutal killing has obviously looked to dispose of the body parts, hoping that the tide will carry it out far into the North Sea and that they'll never be discovered. The North Sea hasn't played ball. There's been a storm the night before, and that is what has returned the head and the hands back to shore, awaiting discovery.
Detectives now faced a mystery. They had human remains, but whose? Police wanted to share a picture of the woman's face with the public, but her time in the water had left her unrecognisable.
Identifying the victim of this horrific crime was absolutely vital, because without the identification, the investigation, it would be very difficult for it to proceed.
Detectives turned to expert witness Professor Caroline Wilkinson, a specialist in forensic facial reconstruction at Liverpool's John Moores University.
There are many changes that happen to a body post-mortem. Some of that is based on the loss of muscle tone, some of that is to do with the lack of blood flow to the face. In this case, there is also the effects of being in the water, and that can lead to bloating or swelling of certain areas, and also some debris that might attach to the face based on being in the sea. Our job is to adapt it so that we're making it look more like a living person and less like a dead face. And we do that through knowledge of what happens to a face post-mortem, so that we can interpret what we're seeing in the remains to tell us about what the living shape or living details will have been.
The police sent Professor Wilkinson high-resolution photos of the severed head that was found on the beach. But Professor Wilkinson had very little to go on.
So we knew what colour hair she had, what colour eyes, some of her facial features, and then some of those identifying characteristics.
Professor Wilkinson imported the high-resolution photos she'd been sent by Tayside police into her photo editing system and began to create a computer image of what the victim may have looked like.
The first thing we need to do is to open the eyes. So effectively what we're doing is we're estimating the position of the iris on both of the eyes, and then we're adding alternative lids around that iris based on the shape that we can see of her lids as they're closed. So the important elements that we brought out are this sickle-shaped scar on her forehead, eye shape and eye colour, and we wanted to highlight her dental pattern, so her front teeth, because they were somewhat characteristic. So we highlighted those teeth, brought the colour out of them, and also slightly changed the shape of the lips so that we're taking into account that movement post-mortem. So we're highlighting overall face shape, her teeth, her eyes, that scar on her forehead and her hair.
Within hours of Professor Wilkinson's image being released, members of the public had identified her. Jolanta Bladaite, a 35-year-old migrant worker from Lithuania. She had arrived in Brecon in Angus just 18 months earlier. It was the breakthrough police were hoping for.
Once they identified Jolanta from the facial reconstruction, they were then able to establish where she lived and to begin the intense forensic examination of her flat.
It appeared that someone had tried to make it look as if Jolanta had moved out of the flat she had shared with a co-worker. All her personal possessions had been removed.
Although it had been cleaned to some extent and cleared out, they did find some traces of blood. They were able to DNA test that, and it turned out it was Jolanta Blodaitis' blood. Further forensic analysis in the bathroom revealed further traces of blood underneath the carpet. So despite the fact that whoever done this had tried to clean up, there was evidence left behind of the horrific events that had been carried out in that bathroom.
Police believed that Jolanta had been murdered in her flat and that her body had been dismembered in the bathroom. But by whom? At the time, there were an estimated 4,000 migrant workers living in the area. Police began looking into Jolanta's co-workers, and in particular, her flatmate, 19-year-old Alexandra Skurda. In the days after Jolanta went missing, Skurda had been caught on CCTV with another man. The two were seen with a plastic bag, taking a bus to Arbroath. The next day, they returned to Arbroath, where they were seen dragging a suitcase through the streets towards the pier. But police had nothing to link Alexandra Skurda to Jolanta's murder. Back at the flat, they made another discovery.
The investigators also checked out wheelie bins outside the flat and discovered some of Jolanta Blodaitis' clothing, and they also found gaffer tape in that wheelie bin. That gaffer tape had large chunks of Jolanta Blodaitis' hair in it, so the police are now beginning to build up a picture of just what this woman had gone through at the hands of her killers.
Police sent the gaffer tape for DNA and fingerprint analysis.
On the gaffer tape that they found in the wheelie bin is Skurda's DNA, and there are fingerprints. So he immediately becomes a prime suspect, and under pressure of questioning, he admits his guilt.
Alexandra Skurda told Tayside police that he had acted with another Lithuanian migrant worker, 41-year-old father of one, Vitas Pletnikas. Pletnikas was a former Russian soldier who served a jail sentence in Germany for killing a man in a knife attack in 2001. Skurda told police that both of them were responsible for torturing and murdering Jolanta.
Alexandras Skurda tells the police what he and Vitas Pletnikas have done. 29th of March, 7:30 in the morning, Alexandras phones Pletnikas, who comes round to the flat. They then begin to torture Jolanta to get her to give up her PIN number for her bank account. They think she's got £10,000 in that account, and they want it. They torture her with knives. Initially, she gives them a false number. Doesn't work. They come back to the flat, and the torture continues until she gives them the right number. She would no doubt know that once she gave them what they wanted, they had no further use for her, and they were going to kill her. The pair smother her with a pillow, they take her into the bathroom, and they begin to dismember her body.
With Alexandra Skurda's confession and with his DNA found on the gaffer tape in the wheelie bin, the police knew they would get a conviction. But there was no forensic evidence at all linking Vitas Pletnikas to the crime. Tayside police needed to find evidence linking him to Jolanta's murder.
Once they'd killed Jolanta and they'd cut up her body, they put the head and the hands into a supermarket carrier bag, and they took it onto a bus. There were other passengers, including children, sitting within feet of these men. They got to Arbroath, and the bag was thrown into the sea. They're seen with the rest of Jolanta's body in a suitcase, dragging it through the streets of Arbroath down to the harbour, where again it's flung into the water. It's recovered by police divers a few days later.
Both men were charged with the torture and murder of Jolanta Bloedite and taken into custody.
Even before they murdered Jolanta, this pair had a fearsome reputation amongst migrant workers. They knew just how bad these two men were.
At his trial at the High Court in Edinburgh, Alexandra Skurda pleaded guilty to the torture and murder of Jolanta Bloedite, and also to using Jolanta's bank cards to steal £1,400. He was sentenced to a minimum of 20 years in prison.
Bloedite comes to trial the following February at the High Court. Bloedite denied any involvement. There was no DNA evidence against him, but despite that, it took the jury just 2.5 hours to find him guilty of the murder of Jolanta.
At the High Court in Edinburgh, Vitas Plutnikis was sentenced to a minimum of 28 years in prison for the torture and murder of Jolanta Bloedite.
These are the two men found guilty of the horrific murder of Jolanta Bloedite. Vitas Plutnikis and Alexandra Skurda dismembered and disposed of her body.
But without the work of expert witness Professor Caroline Wilkinson, it's possible that both killers might never have been caught.
The work of Caroline Wilkinson in this case was absolutely vital, I think, to the outcome in convicting these two men of this dreadful murder. It gave the police that early identification of the victim, and they could then link her to the people that she knew who'd tortured and killed her.
The fact that the depiction in this case was key to the identification progressing and then the murder conviction is obviously very satisfying for us. It also means that in the future the end products will get better and better.